So this is the last session of today. The title of the next presentation is "What Does It Mean to Live the Teachings?" with David Moody. David Moody is the author of 3 books about Krishnamurti. His most recent book is Krishnamurti in America, New Perspectives on the Man and His Message. This biography examines the whole of Krishnamurti's life and work, with special attention to the crucial events in the United States that have been neglected or overlooked by previous biographers. David worked closely with Krishnamurti during the early years of the school, Oak Grove School, where he served as a teacher, educational director, and director. Further information about David and his work is available at davidedmundmoody.com. After the presentation, we will have a panel for 30 minutes.
So no, we need to go back. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It looks like quite a good group today. I think I see about 60 people in this room, and I was just told that 1,500 people signed up to take in the gathering online. Quite remarkable. And actually, that reminds me of something I was thinking about this morning. I'll just share with you before I start my talk. The last time that Krishnamurti spoke in Ojai at the Oak Grove was May of 1985, which is exactly 40 years ago. And that number, 40 years, has a little bit of significance because Krishnamurti used to say that when people start an organization, it rarely lasts beyond 40 years after the founder dies. I don't know where he got that figure of 40 years, but he was quite intent. He said it's been demonstrated over and over again. And so he wondered out loud whether or not the foundations and the school would continue to function strongly in the years after his death. And I just have to think that he would be pleased to see such a good turnout 40 years after his last opportunity to speak here. So, with that, let's get on with the show. So, some of you may be familiar with the story of Krishnamurti's life, and you may know that Ojai was the nearest thing he had to a place that he could call home. And so when he was in India at the end of 1985, and he was very ill, it was Ojai where he wanted to be at the end of his life. And so he cut short the other travel plans that he had, and he came straight to Ojai and arrived here for the last time in January of 1986. And very shortly after his arrival here, he received the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, and so there was no longer really any doubt at all that the end was near. And so he called together some of the trustees from the 3 Krishnamurti foundations to come to Ojai and iron out some issues for which they had a shared responsibility. And one of the trustees who came here from England was a woman named Mary Cadogan. She was the main person in charge of the day-to-day operations of the English Foundation. Mary was a tall woman with a very strong, outgoing personality, and she was also a highly regarded author of books for children. And at that time, I was serving as director of Oak Grove School, and in that capacity, I got to know Mary a little bit over the years. And so when it came time for her to leave Ojai and go back to England, she asked me to drive her down to the airport in Los Angeles. And on our way there, she made a kind of a special point of telling me that just the day before, she had written down a question for Krishnamurti. She didn't have an opportunity to put the question to him herself, but she wrote it down and she left it with Mary Zimbalist, Krishnamurti's secretary and companion, with the hope that Mary Zimbalist could find a good opportunity to present the question to Krishnamurti. I kind of had the feeling that Mary Cadogan wanted me to make sure that Mary Zimbalist didn't somehow overlook this or forget to put the question. But she need not have worried, because the very next day, Mary Zimbalist did indeed tell Krishnamurti about the question that Mary Cadogan had left. And here is what the question was. She wrote, "I know the traditional answer, of course, but would so much like to hear what Kay has to say about it. The question is, when Krishnamurti dies, what really happens to that extraordinary focus of understanding and energy that is Kay?" Now, when Mary Zimbalist read this question to Krishnamurti, she was not prepared to record his answer, but she wrote down what he said as he was speaking, and his answer was this. He said, "It," meaning that energy, "is gone. But if someone goes wholly into the teachings, they might touch that. But one cannot try to touch it." So that was his initial response. But that was not the end of it, because a little later that morning, Krishnamurti decided that he had more to say on the subject. And this time, he requested that his answer be recorded. And he asked Scott Forbes to bring a recording device. Scott Forbes was the principal of Brockwood Park School and was staying in the house at that time with Krishnamurti and Mary Zimbalist. So he asked Scott Forbes to bring a recording device, and that is when he made the longer statement that you may have read or heard about. So I'm describing all this background so that you can see the context in which the longer recorded statement was made. It was not something incidental or accidental or casual. It was very deliberate. Now, this occurred only 10 days before Krishnamurti passed away, and it was an effort for him to speak at all. Mary Zimbalist said that his voice was weak, but that he spoke with, quote, intent emphasis. Now, I should also mention what happened immediately afterwards, because Scott Forbes expressed some concern about the statement. He felt that it might be misunderstood and maybe needed some clarification. But Krishnamurti was having none of it. He even became a little bit upset with Scott and told him, "You have no right to interfere in this." So I don't think there can be any doubt that Krishnamurti made this statement with all deliberation and a sense of complete conviction in what he was saying. So with that background in mind, let's look at the statement again. Some of you may have seen it before, but I think it's worthwhile to look at it again. He said, "For 70 years, that immense energy, immense intelligence has been using this body. I don't think people realize what tremendous energy and intelligence went through this body. It It was like a 12-cylinder engine, and it went on for 70 years. It was a pretty long time, and now the body can't stand anymore. Nobody can understand unless the body has been prepared, very carefully protected and so on. Nobody can understand what went through this body. Don't anybody pretend. I repeat this. Nobody amongst us or the public knows what went on. I know they don't. And now, after 70 years, it has come to an end. Not that intelligence and energy, it's somewhat here every day, especially at night. And after 70 years, the body can't stand anymore. You won't find another body like this, or that supreme intelligence operating in a body, for many hundred years. You won't see it again. When he goes, it goes. There is no consciousness left behind of that consciousness, that state. They'll all pretend or try to imagine that they can get into touch with that. Perhaps they will, somewhat, if they live the teachings. But nobody has done it. Nobody. And so, that's that. Now, this is a remarkable statement for several reasons. It's a little over 200 words, and in that space, Krishnamurti uses the word nobody 5 times. He says, nobody can understand, nobody knows what went on. Another unusual feature is there's no mention of Krishnamurti himself as an individual in the entire statement. There's only the body and the immense energy. The energy used the body, went through the body, operated in the body. It's almost as if he himself wasn't even there, just the body and the immense energy. Now, this is the last recorded statement that Krishnamurti ever made in his life. And I think it's reasonable for us to ask, why did he make this statement and have it be recorded? After all, he had already answered the question when Mary Zimbalist first presented it to him. Well, if you examine the statement closely, you can see that the main thrust of it lies somewhere else. Towards the end of it, he does again answer the actual question. What becomes of that focus of energy? When he goes, it goes. There is no consciousness left behind of that consciousness. But that is not the main point of this statement. I don't think it's the reason why he asked Scott Forbes to bring the recording device. So after his initial response to Mary Zimbalist, I think he must have realized that there was an implication in Mary Cadogan's question that he had not yet addressed. Because for Mary Cadogan even to ask what becomes of that energy kind of implies that she has some notion of what she's asking about. And that, I think, was the idea that he wanted to dispel. That's what he felt was so important, that he had to record a statement about it. Because the primary thrust of the statement is to say, you have no idea what that energy is that you're asking about. You think you have some clue, but the fact is, you actually have no idea. Nobody can understand what went through this body. I repeat this. Nobody amongst us or the public knows what went on. I know they don't. So the interesting thing he is saying is not what becomes of that energy. The interesting thing is the quality of that energy itself. You cannot even imagine the immensity of it. It takes a very unusual body just to withstand it. But there is a caveat. There's an exception to the rule. The rule is, when he goes, it goes. There's nothing left behind of that consciousness. But there is one exception to the rule, and that is, if you live the teachings. Or, as he put it in his first answer to Mary Zimbalist, if someone goes wholly into the teachings, then they might get in touch with that same quality of energy. So he included this point both in his initial answer to Mary Zimbalist and again in the recorded statement. I think that really highlights the significance of it. But he also says, nobody has done it. Nobody. So that brings me to the subject of my talk today, which is, what does it mean to live the teachings? What is this thing that nobody has done, but which might enable someone to touch that immense energy and intelligence? So what does it actually mean to live the teachings? Now, in order to understand this, I think first we have to know what we mean by the teachings, because it's not as obvious as it might seem at first glance, because the teachings are immense. They're kind of like that energy that went through his body. They represent a monumental expression of that energy. So our first task today is going to be to formulate some kind of model of the teachings, something that will suggest the nature and complexity of what we're dealing with. So I'm going to use the metaphor of a building, a 4-story building, to describe some of the major themes present in Krishnamurti's work. And please bear in mind, this is just a rough approximation. And so the 4-story building, this model for the teachings, looks something like this. At the most basic level, even below the 4 stories, this building has a foundation. And this foundation consists of a set of principles on which the whole structure rests. These principles describe the essential nature of thought and observation. So let's recall some of these basic principles. Krishnamurti says, thought is the response of memory. Thought is mechanical. It is fragmentary. Observe without naming the thing that you're observing. And inwardly, psychologically, the observer is the observed. And so on. These are just a few of the many insights about thought and observation that comprise the foundation of this edifice. Their influence is present throughout the rest of the structure. So now let's turn to the first floor of this building. This floor corresponds to the inner life of each individual. This is where Krishnamurti examines the nature of fear and desire and envy and sorrow and pleasure and violence and so on. We can think of each one of these issues as being like a room in this floor. Krishnamurti goes into each room and examines what the issue actually is, how it functions, and how it affects our daily life. So the first floor corresponds to you as an individual and the psychological phenomena that each one of us deals with, more or less, almost every day of our lives. The second floor is all about relationship, our personal relationships with people, with property, and with ideas. Krishnamurti says that life is relationship. To be is to be related. So this floor corresponds with issues such as attachment to people or to our possessions, or what it really means to love someone. This floor is very important because it's the quality of our personal relationships that tends to dominate our mental lives. We're often preoccupied with the latest episode with our boss or parent or child or spouse or partner. And, this is the kind of material that fills up the offices of psychotherapists. And Krishnamurti's principles regarding thought and observation are very relevant here. He shows, for example, how our relationships are often colored by memories of what someone has said or done in the past, and how this prevents us from seeing the actual person in the present moment. The third floor corresponds to our relationship to all of humanity. You know, Krishnamurti often says, "You are the world," and he means something very specific by that. It's not an idealistic statement. It's not a goal to be achieved or some kind of mystical vision. When he says, "You are the world," he means that fundamentally, human beings are much more alike, more similar to one another than they are different. But when we think about people with a different language or religion or way of living, we often feel these differences are highly significant. Krishnamurti says this emphasis is superficial, and it obscures or covers up a much more important fact, a reality, because underneath those differences, we're all very similar. We all suffer, not just physically, but psychologically. We're all afraid of someone or something or some event in the future. We all want to become something more or different or better than what we are. So the basic dynamics of human psychology are held in common by people across all cultures, all ways of life. This is a fact, he says, but one that we're blind to because we're preoccupied with superficial differences. Finally, we come to the fourth floor at the top of this building. This floor is a little different from the others because it doesn't have any ceiling. It can have chairs and other furniture, but overhead it's open to the skies because this is the floor that corresponds with what Krishnamurti calls the unlimited or the immeasurable. This is where he talks about the quiet mind or freedom from the known. This floor is where he talks about meditation. What he means by that, however, is very different from the conventional understanding. He says that deliberate meditation is no meditation at all. He says that where there is the meditator, psychologically, there is no meditation. And yet he considers it very important to learn about meditation and to come upon that state of mind. So the metaphor of the fourth-story building is intended to provide a quick overview of the tremendous scope of Krishnamurti's teachings. There's a great deal that we have not even included, such as a psychological authority, or his educational philosophy, or what he had to say about nature. But I hope this metaphor is sufficient to show how vast, how comprehensive is the subject matter of Krishnamurti's work. It covers the entire field of life and consciousness. And this is important to bear in mind when we consider the question, what does it mean to live the teachings? Because what could it possibly mean to live something so enormous? No wonder he said that nobody has done it. Nobody. So now let's consider some of the states of mind that might be included in or correspond with living the teachings. One of the issues that Krishnamurti addresses most commonly in his public talks throughout his career is the problem of fear. His concern is not with any particular content, such as losing one's job or public opinion or fear of death. Instead, he's concerned with what he calls the root of fear, which means the basic psychological elements that are common to all forms of fear. He says that if we understand it at this deep level, then it's possible to live without fear entirely. So I think that must be part of what it means to live the teachings. Surely this question of how to be free from fear is one of our major problems, is it not? Perhaps it is the only problem, because it is fear lurking in the innermost recesses of our minds and hearts, which cripples our thinking, our being, our living. So it seems to me that what we need now are true individuals who are utterly free from fear. Another issue that appears throughout the teachings is what Krishnamurti calls becoming. This refers to the drive in each one of us to become someone psychologically more or different or better than what we are. Krishnamurti considers this urge to be misguided and the source of a great deal of mischief and misery. So I think we have to say that living the teachings must include an insight into the process of becoming and learning to live without that chronic urge or drive. This concern to become something more, is it not a primary cause of superficiality? That is what we all want, to understand more, to have more property, to have better brains, to look more beautiful. Always the more, the more, the more. And as long as the mind is occupied with the more, can it ever understand what is? Yet another issue that is pervasive in the teachings is psychological conflict. Krishnamurti maintains that if we observe closely, we'll see that conflict is endemic within ourselves on almost a daily basis. And conflict is also prevalent in our personal relationships, as well as on a much larger scale between cultures or races or nations. You know, some people claim that conflict is inevitable or even desirable as a spur to biological evolution or to personal achievement. But Krishnamurti considers psychological conflict to be highly dysfunctional. He doesn't regard it from any kind of moralistic or judgmental point of view, but rather he says conflict is a wastage of energy, and we need that energy in order to see clearly, to understand what is happening within and around ourselves. So to be without conflict must represent another characteristic of what it means to live the teachings. For me, conflict is a very destructive thing, inwardly as well as outwardly. And I want to find out if there is a way of living without being in conflict. Now, some of you may be familiar with the statement that Krishnamurti made in 1929 when he dissolved the Order of the Star. At that time, he declared his intention for the rest of his life. My only concern, he said, was to set human beings free. So this too must be an essential element of what it means to live the teachings. He said, I have now decided to disband the order as I happen to be its head. You can form other organizations and expect someone else. With that, I am not concerned, nor with creating new cages, new decorations for those cages. My only concern is to set men absolutely, unconditionally free. But Krishnamurti's idea of freedom is very different from the common conventional meaning. He's not concerned with political freedom or economic freedom or some kind of permission structure that allows people to behave however they like. Instead, he's talking about psychological freedom, which has a very unusual meaning. He talks about freedom from knowledge, freedom from the known, or a state of mind that is not clouded or shaped by images or memories from the past. He says, now the only real freedom is freedom from the known. Please follow this a little. It is freedom from the past. The known has its place, obviously. I must know certain things in order to function in everyday life. But we remain in the field of the known, with all its conflicts, striving, disputes, agonies. And from that field, we try to find that which is unknown. Therefore, we're not really seeking freedom. What we want is the continuation, the extension of the same old thing, the known. Now, there's several other issues that Krishnamurti refers to regularly, which point toward highly unusual or distinctive states of mind. He says it's possible to examine sorrow in such a way that sorrow dissolves and turns into passion. He also talks about the importance of having a quiet mind. And encompassing all of this is the more general idea of a psychological transformation. He says this is the only really significant form of change for the individual and for society. One observes the catastrophic state of the world, and one feels that there must be a tremendous revolution, a complete mutation in the mind, so that the human being really is a human being, one who is free of problems, free of sorrow, one who lives a full, rich, complete existence. That is why I talk, and I hope that is also why you are listening. So these are all states of mind that Krishnamurti recommends as beneficial or worthwhile to realize or bring about. Let's quickly review what we have touched upon so far. Living the teachings seems to mean living without fear, living without conflict, ending the process of becoming, freedom from the known, and perhaps encompassing all of that, psychological transformation. Now, I don't mean to say that this list is final or definitive, but it is representative of issues that Krishnamurti addresses frequently. And so I think these items do suggest at least some of what it means to live the teachings. Now, there's another side to this question that we haven't yet considered, and that has to do with what kind of process or procedure is necessary to bring about these states of mind. Because Krishnamurti has a great deal to say about that also. In particular, he's concerned about activities that are contrary or antithetical to living the teachings. So let's examine some of the approaches that he feels are false or dysfunctional. First and foremost, Krishnamurti insists that there is not any kind of method, any system or technique capable of bringing about the states of mind that we have described. A method is a mechanical procedure for bringing about a predictable result. It's perfectly suitable for achieving results in the outer world of matter and energy. But inwardly, no method can bring about insight or understanding, and those are what precipitate psychological change. And yet we're conditioned to accept methods or techniques to achieve results inwardly as well as outwardly. So Krishnamurti considers that to be very misguided. We're also conditioned to believe that change occurs as a result of having definite goals and strong motivations to achieve those goals. But here again, Krishnamurti adopts an unconventional point of view. Goals and motives may be appropriate in outward activities, but they're counterproductive for purposes of psychological change. We have a motive when we have projected something that we want to achieve in the future. But the future state of affairs is not an actuality. Therefore, it distracts us from giving attention to what is happening now. And only attention to what is happening now inwardly enables us to understand it and move beyond it. So Krishnamurti says that psychological change can occur only if we put aside any motive or the urge to achieve any kind of result. A questioner once said he had been observing his own thoughts, as Krishnamurti had suggested, but it didn't seem to produce any result. Krishnamurti answered, "You think that by watching your own thoughts you're going to get a reward. If you do this, you will get that. You are really not watching at all because your mind is concerned with gaining a reward. To watch is to observe without choice, to see yourself as you actually are without any movement of the desire to change, which is an extremely arduous thing to do." This is one of my favorite quotations. It was me who put those words in italics, without any movement of the desire to change. I feel that's a crucial feature of the kind of observation that he's trying to describe. And it's also significant that he says it's an extremely arduous thing to do. We also need to consider the question of effort. Krishnamurti uses the word effort in a particular way. He says that effort arises when there is a gap or division between what is and what we think should be, and it requires effort to close that gap. The result is psychological conflict, which interferes with the attention that is necessary to understand what is actually taking place. Positive or negative effort, the effort to be or not to be, is based on fear, on the urge to gain, to find comfort, peace, security. So any change through conscious effort is not change at all. It's merely an adjustment to a different pattern. Of that, one must see the truth completely. But here we have to be careful to grasp the distinction he's making, because no effort does not mean that it is easy. Far from it. Krishnamurti says the kind of change he's talking about is difficult. He once said you have to be working furiously to bring it about. But it's not the kind of work that involves closing a gap between what is psychologically and what should be. It's another kind of work altogether. Finally, we need to consider a common characteristic of how we normally go about doing things. Very often our action is the result of an image or concept of what it is that we want to do. Krishnamurti calls this action according to an idea, and he considers it to be another source of conflict and confusion. So if we were to form a concept of what it means to live the teachings, and then try to shape our action to match that idea, that in itself would contradict the very thing that we're trying to achieve. If you observe yourself, you will see that there is a concept, an image, an idea according to which you are living. You're always approximating your action to that idea, thereby creating friction, conflict, and losing energy. So Krishnamurti rejects many of the activities that we normally consider essential to bring about psychological change. Methods, motives, the exercise of effort, and acting according to an idea. These are all antithetical to what he means by living the teachings. So now let's try to distill or summarize where we have come in our attempt to understand what it could mean to live the teachings. We have two sets of issues. On the one hand, we have some desirable or worthwhile states of mind. On the other hand, we have some false or dysfunctional ways of bringing about these states of mind. So here is where we have come so far. Living the teaching seems to mean living without fear or conflict, ending the process of becoming, freedom from the known, and psychological transformation. And yet, no method or technique, no motive, no effort, and no action based on an idea. Now, I think we could be forgiven for feeling that this presents us with an impossible situation. It's as if we're being asked to climb Mount Everest, but without any of the techniques or equipment that mountain climbers normally use as a matter of course. And maybe that is why students of Krishnamurti's work sometimes give up or conclude that what he is proposing is just too difficult. On the other hand, Krishnamurti does offer some light at the end of the tunnel, because he also describes a way of approaching his work that is valid and meaningful. What he describes is simple in some respects, but it's also demanding, subtle, and somewhat elusive. So now let's look at some of the activities or processes that are actually consistent or harmonious with living the teachings. Perhaps the most significant element of this kind is a state of mind that is serious, that is earnest, in the sense that it's devoted to learning what is true. Learning what is true means ending illusion, and it includes understanding what it is that distorts perception, that blocks or colors the seeing of what is. A serious mind, therefore, is dedicated to understanding itself, its own operation, because that is the source of illusion and distortion. That means a mind engaged in observing and grasping the significance of its own thoughts and feelings and impulses and desires. Seriousness is that urge, that intention to go to the very end of things and discover the essence. And if there is not that compulsive energy which drives one to discover what is true, then I'm afraid these talks will have very little significance. I call that mind serious, which is constantly looking, observing, being aware of itself and others, watching its own gestures, words, the way it talks, and which is also aware of all its own conditioning. Many of you have heard me repeatedly, fortunately or unfortunately, for the last 40 years, and had you been serious, you would have been completely transformed. Krishnamurti uses the phrase self-knowledge to refer to this kind of observation. This phrase might be a little bit confusing because it's not what we ordinarily think of as knowledge. It's not something that we accumulate and store up as memory. He sometimes calls it self-knowing in order to make this distinction. It's an awareness that occurs in the present moment, and that's all that is required. The knowing of oneself is entirely different from the process of acquiring knowledge about oneself, because knowing is a constant movement. But if, having watched yourself a little here and there, you say, I know myself, that knowledge is merely additive, accumulative, and it is stifling, deadly. It brings only darkness. Whereas knowing is an indefinite movement. Now, such a state of mind is not too difficult to describe, but it is quite a challenge to bring it about in the course of daily life. So let's look at some of the obstacles or impediments. Suppose something happens that makes you suddenly angry. Now, what do you do with that anger? Krishnamurti suggests that you give it your total attention. In other words, someone who is serious about understanding themselves wants to learn about the anger. Therefore, he simply watches it. He or she doesn't suppress it or justify it. His or her only relationship to the anger is to understand it. But if you are actually in this situation, you will find this is difficult to do. Your whole psychological apparatus gets mobilized to lash out and defend yourself. It requires a very serious intention not to get lost in all these reactions and simply to let the anger be, to watch how it arises, how it moves, and how it fades away. And the ways in which we distort our perception can be very subtle. One of the principal forms of distortion is merely to name the feeling as anger. Krishnamurti says the very naming of the feeling is a kind of condemnation because of the attitudes embedded in that word. So the opportunity for distortion is quick and subtle. The very words envy, anger, jealousy imply judgment, comparison, condemnation. Do they not? Through centuries of education, of culture, of religious training, these words have come to connote a sense of denunciation. They stand for something to be put aside, resisted, fought. So I find that when I name certain feelings, I'm already in a position of condemnation. Now, a crucial part of self-knowledge is what Krishnamurti calls choiceless awareness. This is a form of observation that is untainted, uncolored by any assessment of what is good or bad, right or wrong. But there's a subtle distinction involved in this, because not evaluating a feeling does not mean that you're blind to the actual nature of it, which may be dysfunctional or destructive. Let's consider what Krishnamurti has to say about envy. When that feeling arises, he suggests we observe it completely, give it our full attention, but without condemning it or even naming it as envy. And yet, when we observe in the way he recommends, he says that we will see that envy is ugly and stupid. One must surely see the truth that ambition, envy, is ugly, stupid, and one must destroy all these absurdities. Now, when Krishnamurti says that envy is ugly and stupid, he evidently considers that to be a fact, a reality, part of what is, but not a form of condemnation. So this distinction is subtle. It's not obvious how we can see something as being ugly and stupid, yet not be evaluating it. But that is clearly a distinction he is making. We can see something similar in Krishnamurti's answer to the following question. A questioner said to him, "I no longer suppress my thoughts, and I am shocked by what sometimes arises." Now, you might think that Krishnamurti would say, well, if you are shocked, you must be condemning those thoughts, and then you will never be able to understand them. But instead, he says this: it is good to be shocked, isn't it? Shock implies sensitivity, doesn't it? We don't want to know ourselves as we are. So to discover oneself as one is a shocking thing, and it should be. So choiceless awareness is not a way of overlooking the actual significance of our various thoughts and feelings and states of mind. And our awareness is not, in fact, choiceless most of the time. Most of us routinely evaluate what we see in ourselves. These reactions are deeply ingrained in something we consider normal or even desirable and worthwhile. So to drop all of this and merely observe is a very unusual state of mind. Those evaluative reactions occur very quickly, and they occur of their own accord. You can't just decide to stop doing it and have it all go away. The only way it can happen is if you are serious about seeing yourself without any form of distortion. In other words, those evaluative reactions can subside only if we really understand how they distort perception. They shape or color the thing we're trying to observe. So the urgency of seeing clearly is what enables those reactions to fade away, not our desire or decision to do anything about it. What else is required to bring about self-knowledge? Well, as we've discussed, Krishnamurti says that any form of motive is counterproductive to awareness. Having a motive brings in the element of time. It means there's something we want to achieve in the future. And with part of your mind focused on the future, you cannot give your attention to whatever is happening now. So the urge to understand what is taking place in the present is the intention that drives self-knowing, not the hope of achieving something in the future. Krishnamurti puts it like this: without a deep awareness of yourself, of what is taking place inwardly, you simply have no basis for anything. No basis for thinking or feeling or action of any kind. So that realization is what precipitates self-knowledge, and therefore it's the beginning of what it means to live the teachings. He says, if you do not know yourself, your unconscious as well as your conscious states, all your inquiry will be twisted, given a bias. You will have no foundation for thinking which is rational, clear, logical, sane. To learn about yourself is to be without motive, and that is the beauty of self-knowing. You don't want to become a great person or a famous saint. You just want to learn about yourself as you would want to learn about a most extraordinary flower that you had found in the desert. He says, we are in a desert, and we are the most extraordinary flowers. To look at the flower, to smell it, to understand it, we must love that flower. Krishnamurti calls his approach to these issues the negative approach, which means negating, stripping away that which is false. If you strip away the false, then what remains is valid, worthwhile, true. And what remains after we strip away the false elements is self-awareness, self-knowledge, that does not come about in order to achieve anything or in an effort to live up to the ideal of Krishnamurti. It's the kind of awareness that comes from the sheer interest or love for discovery itself. That is the soil in which real intelligence can flourish and possibly even put you in contact with what Krishnamurti called that immense energy. I think we have time for some questions.
Thank you, David.
We're gonna come around.
Sometimes they are. I think my thing is coming. Dean?
Yeah.
I think my thing might be coming off. I don't know.
Oh, okay, I'll check
It might be all right. I think it's all right.
Hello, hello. Yes, now I'm realizing you two haven't been introduced. If you want to say a little bit who you are, the name even.
Nobody.
Ideally. Well, John Duncan, maybe the name sounded, it's John Duncan. And Mary was?
Kelly. Mary Kelly.
Mary Kelly. Perfect, okay. Let's leave it there. I have some questions from the online audience, and at some point we'll have questions from here as well. I don't know if any of you have any comments.
Yeah, well, something did occur to me that I just thought I'd bring up, and that was, as you were so eloquently explaining the teachings with that very helpful metaphor, it occurred to me something that I think Krishnamurti also said around the time he was gathering all of those people together near the end of his life. And it's a statement that stayed with me. I'm not sure I'm quoting it exactly right, but I bring it up often in dialogue. And that is where he said, if it's impossible, it's worth doing. And the moment I hear that, it seems to arrest in me that tendency to want to figure out how to go about living the teachings from the perspective of what is possible. And therefore what is known and has already therefore been done. And has not met, really, the what is of life. So there's that, and I wonder if you have anything to say on that. And then similarly to that, I feel as though part of our difficulty with remaining with the impossible and actually allowing it to inform action is our inability or our distaste for really being in mystery of something, really allowing something to be a mystery and remaining with the mystery of it, the not knowing of it, which doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, it's worthless and there's nothing for us to do with it. So, I don't know, the word mystery, the word, if it's impossible, it's worth doing. I didn't know if you had any words on that.
Yeah, I like the part where you, similar to mystery or impossible, is the state of mind of not knowing.
Yeah.
When Krishnamurti used to meet with Oak Grove teachers, he had many meetings with Oak Grove teachers, and a question would be put, and the various teachers would try out various answers, which were inevitably wrong. And after a while, it became clear that he was not looking so much for any particular answer, that rather he was welcoming a state of mind of not knowing.
Yeah.
And being comfortable with being in that place of not knowing, because that would be a place where something new and creative could come that doesn't come from the storehouse of memory, of knowledge, but is perhaps an insight or something new and perhaps true.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe that connects with something that I was also thinking of. The way that Krishnamurti proposes this change, maybe, of this process, if it is a process, it almost the impression I have is like it doesn't give us any entry point, because when he starts talking about the ending of fear or the dissolution of the self, and then, but before that, it's almost like, before in quotes, you need to be serious, but in order to be serious about this, you should not come from the self. So it becomes this, this other side where you start feeling like, where can I start that is the right place, or the clear or the clean first step? And of course there is his famous phrase, the first step is the last step.
Yeah.
So there is something about what he's presenting that it starts looking like, okay, there is, where is how do I start?
How do you get into it? Right, yeah. It reminds me, in 1972, he was speaking in the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, which holds like 2,000 or 3,000 people. And I was attending his talks there, and he let people at the end of the talk stand up and ask him questions. And I said something like, according to him, in order to be free, you have to see, but in order to see, you have to be free. So isn't that a paradox? It's a little bit similar to what
Yes.
you're putting up. So I don't know if you start with any particular objective ending fear or insight into this or that. I think perhaps what you start with is just that something that you can always do at any moment, and that is observe what is happening now without judgment. That's a very unusual thing to do, but it's the beginning of the whole process. And you can step into that at any time, anytime. Or try to, experiment with it. You can't, necessarily deliberately do it, but you can experiment with it and learn about what that means.
You want to talk? I question if the I can be serious. I don't know that that's necessarily what he meant. I think perhaps the seriousness must exist first, or it must be present, and it's the seriousness. One might also use the word love, which we know nothing about really, thank goodness, that must be present in order to see. But it isn't Mary who's doing it. If it is, then it's most likely not what he's talking about.
Something that comes, hello, is this thing on? Can you hear me? Okay. That comes to my mind when you were talking about mystery and not knowing. Those things to me in a person, including myself, who was just getting into this, is suffering. And I've actually heard him say, someone asked, you've been listening to this for 40 years, why haven't they changed? People are afraid to suffer. They're afraid to start from where they're at versus starting with a solution but more important than that, I would like to say that to start with a teacher like Krishnamurti, I think we feel like Krishnamurti pushes us out of the nest before he even says his last word on his first talk or something. But I don't think it's really that way at all. I think he really did see himself as a teacher, otherwise he wouldn't have taught for 65 years. And there is a relationship there that builds in the natural guru type of way that's very fortifying to the suffering individual. It's like food from the mother eagle to the baby eagle in that proper sense. That we're not dependent upon it, but we're in need of that sustenance. like in India, a guru will say the same thing Jesus said. He said, "You cannot come to this except through me, because you don't even know what it is. I'm representing it in a manifest form. Look at me, see what it is, and then find it in yourself." I say this because I always hear this quote about nobody got it. 40 years and nobody got it, you know, and I hear it back from so many people, and they're so interested in that statement. But I feel that maybe that's because they feel like they have to do it so much on their own, and that there's no relationship to anything but what they think they understand in the moment, you know, versus really, really going into it wholly, as he said in there, which means really interacting with it till you understand exactly 10 different ways he said it and what it actually means. And that is the value of having someone like him around, and then the birth of a self-knowledge versus somebody else's knowledge, but using their multiple perspective approach on what is or what's going on.
Yeah, one of the quotes that you presented, he said something like, some people here have been listening to me for 40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, in positively or negatively, or something like that, saying for what it's worth. And I think that's maybe what I personally see as a danger of, but there might be no way out of this, but if somebody's presenting to you a different way of living, and you are on this side of the shore, and the only thing that you tend to do is project and create models, then it's almost inevitable that the first thing that you will do is like a whole structure of, oh, this is how the other side looks, and now I feel, you know, that map is giving me something, or to myself or the self, or that is not it, but is something that now I feel I can hold on to. It's almost like a path, right? Even though he keeps saying there is no path, it's almost like, don't listen to me, but I'm telling you something. So I see that as a danger in any way, like almost like a religious, you know, path, even though I understand that that's not his intention. I've spoken more like how the brain works, how my brain works.
There's a difference between winding up with sound bites and not really understanding what those mean, and going through the word and discovering the words turning into energy, for lack of a better description, inside of you. You can do this on your own, and ultimately you do it on your own, but it's not if there's someone there to mentor you, not just him, but someone else in your life, don't turn it down, I say. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Someone can say, hey, it's round, and it's, you get that part? Okay, then do the rest on your own, right? Actually, Krishnamurti did say that. He goes, Columbus discovered America, you don't have to, talking about himself. Just listen to me, and then, turn on the light. Build the light bulb.
We could take some questions from the audience, if that's a good idea. Yeah. Do you mind, Pablo, there is a microphone there. And, yeah. Just to say as a general disclaimer that, questions, and if you have a comment, that's also welcome, but we have to be brief, because there are also some questions online that needs to be answered. Then they get upset that they've been watching and they cannot also ask their own questions. So, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you also, David and Mary and John, for being here. There's so many people here, and also people outside. There were some words that arduous, hard to do, and at the same time, there's conflicting thing. Like, there's a sense as if that living the teachings, and you mentioned once, David, and that is 1929, when it was said that to set people unconditionally free, etc. You mentioned that maybe that is what it means to be living the teachings, and I was just wondering, like, were the teachings there before K existed? And so in reality, it's not like K's teachings. It's just that essential truth exists. And for us, our natural is K pointing to the fact that the reality that our default state of being is beautiful, and that we just need to sort of pull the carpet below us and just dive off the cliff, and we'll gravitate to a state of. And so that's why it's not climbing Mount Everest. It's really just jumping off the cliff into the ocean and swimming. And so as a teacher, I'm curious from Mary, the way he was communicating to adults is different than the way children he's guiding kids. And for kids, their natural tendency is to be spontaneous and just without thought or without this conscious fear-built thought. So I'd love to hear about the issue of the teachings, whether even we should call it teachings, the learnings with K. And so from David and about the geology of the teachings, where did they exist, when did they come, and from Mary about the pedagogy or how we approach with kids. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's yours. Go for it.
Yes, you first. I would just propose that indeed, children do have certainly an innocence about them and a purity of heart and so on, but they are very conditioned from a very early age. So, and thought is very much a part of their existence, and we do a lot to strengthen that in them at quite an early age. So my approach has always been with children, no matter what age I engage with, the approach is seeing them as a fellow human being who daily, as David was pointing to, engages with life in all of the ways that we do, through fear, through attachment, through envy, not to only name the negative ones, but I think children are very much in touch with those fundamental aspects of their humanity, and perhaps what sets them apart is they're less defensive about it when you bring it up, and they're willing to call a spade and not sugarcoat it. So I've found it to be incredibly inspiring and enlightening to engage with 5th and 6th graders, and the teachings seem to speak directly to them in the same way that they do me as an adult.
Regarding whether Krishnamurti if he had any teachings in 1929, at the time he said unconditionally free, he addressed that question a little bit at various times. What I understood him to say was that his fundamental outlook was there pretty much from the beginning, and the work for him was more a matter of learning how to express it, how to articulate it, than the sheer discovery of it. On the other hand, there's also considerable evidence that the teachings didn't really fully mature until after World War II. He was isolated in Ojai for several years, didn't give public talks, and if you examine the talks in the 1930s versus the talks in the 1950s, you'll see there's a significant shift of emphasis and definitely some new ways of approaching things. So that's like 2 different answers to your question, but that's the best I can do.
Pavel.
Okay, thank you very much for an interesting, fascinating talk. And I thought I'd just share a couple of things. What firstly about this seriousness. So, I got interested in Kay around 79, and then by 1980 I was at Brockwood, and it must be some of the first meetings with Kay. Kay used to have meetings with the students, and anyway, so and I was like a mature student, so I could participate in those. And I felt probably one of the first meetings I was pretty nervous and like afraid of asking anything, or just, but I got my courage together somehow, and I asked Krishnamurti, how do you know that you're serious? For some reason that question had bothered me. Am I serious or am I not serious? So I asked him, how do you know if you are serious? And his answer was, it's up to you. And so that was kind of and the other students turned and looked at me and said, yeah, it's up to you. Like, stupid. So anyway, that was still, in that sense, it's interesting that you brought out serious as a sort of method that is implicit in Krishnamurti. And so it's an important question. Now, the other thing was that, of course, this whole thing about nobody understanding the teachings is that I do remember at Brockwood times that Krishnamurti had a little bit more positive moments as well. And I think he once said that if anybody has understood teachings, it's David Bohm. And he would often, there were times, of course their relationship was complex, and David has written an excellent book about that, but I recall often that, like in one of the staff meetings, Krishnaji came to the staff and he just said that David Bohm had telephoned him and said to him that, I want to touch your mind. And I think Kay was very moved about that. And he was almost like asking the staff, why don't you say things like that?
Uh-huh.
Anyway, I just want to share some of these things because thanks for your talk.
Yeah, very good, very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Could you say a little bit more? You touched on the negative effort, but between negative effort and a negative approach, maybe just could you say a few more words on the differences?
Well, what I was trying to say about the negative approach, what Krishnamurti says, he describes his own approach as the negative. He uses those words. This is a negative approach, which means that there are many things that we're always trying to take positive action of one kind or another, and many of those actions, he says, are misguided. Like take methods, for example. Methods are fine in the outer world. They accomplish all kinds of things, but they don't do what we expect them to do inwardly in the psychological field. So it requires an insight. It's a kind of illusion. That's really what the negative approach means. It means negating illusion. And we have a lot of illusions about how the psychological field works. One of the illusions is that we can precipitate change through a method. And so the negative approach is to see the falseness of that. And therefore, you're not trying to have a method anymore, or a motive for the same reason, because it's a false promise in the psychological field. So it's putting away those things that don't work is the negative approach. And then what remains can be valid, worthwhile, because there's still something within us that is interested in truth, interested in seeing, interested in understanding, and to allow that thing to flower by getting rid of all the clutter that interferes with it. That's how I understand what he means by the negative approach.
Thank you.
Yes, on that note on clutter, it seems like maybe it was said that many people didn't understand or grasp fully what he was presenting. Perhaps because, like you said just now, the clutter prevents full understanding. In other words, the clutter in the mind seems to complicate or overcomplicate what he was saying. He seemed to talk a lot about time. I don't know if you mentioned time in your talk, but he also equated time with thought. And he also suggested the ending of time and the ending of the me. And could it be that the ending of time in that sense, and maybe you guys can comment on that, might open the door to that silence of which this weekend is about? Thank you.
Yeah, the issue of time is absolutely crucial in the teachings, and you're right. I didn't find a good place for that in my little metaphor, except to say that motive brings in the element of time. But the thing about time, in terms of the teachings, is you always have to bear in mind that Krishnamurti made a distinction, a huge distinction, between ordinary time by the clock, right? It's 5 minutes of 5. He calls that chronological time, and he has no quarrel with that. That's not his concern. When he talks about the ending of time, he's not talking about the ending of it's 5 minutes until 5. He's talking about something entirely different, which he calls psychological time, which is the projection of me into the future, which is quite a different thing than time by the clock. But you're right to say that the whole issue of psychological time is very fundamental in the teachings, and I agree with you that time is thought, and it's connected with what you said, a way to approach a quiet mind. Yeah, absolutely.
Last question, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Mary. I have 2 daughters who go to school here, and it's been a great honor, privilege, wonderful experience. Mary was my younger daughter's teacher, so
Good.
grateful about that. But I also enjoyed a great day here, going to David's interaction earlier. So thank you for that.
John.
I was curious about, that statement that no one can understand or fully understand the teachings, and sort of the timing of when he made that statement. Obviously his life was a very unusual and unique life by any standard. But I also wonder about if that was a bit of a mysterious foresight in thinking about sort of preventing people from claiming that, moving forward after his death, that they had some type of an insight or some type of a reincarnation experience where they would then become sort of, the guru, the Krishnamurti next guru, right? And if that were so, then to me that kind of also says, because he turns us back again to the teachings and essentially our own experience, right, of the teachings, as well as connecting with teachers, right, which we were talking about before. And so I'm just curious about that. In a way, also you mentioned about the foundation, lasting beyond 40 years, which he wasn't sure would be true. And I think about false prophets, and so I'm just wondering if I'm sure you've considered that, but I was just wondering about actually, maybe we do have access to understanding that energy and intelligence, and it's there. Maybe we're not all we can't all be Krishnamurti in this lifetime, but could that have been potentially a way of turning us towards ourselves and our own community and ways of understanding and teaching our children? And, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting and kind of complicated question. I think I will just, I think I should make the point that it was not only in that very, very last recorded statement that Krishnamurti said, nobody has understood. There was a meeting, he held a meeting in 1977 where he gathered together the trustees from all the foundations, and they met for, I think, 3 weeks. They held like a dozen meetings. This is contained in a book called The Perfume of the Teachings. And in the first chapter of that, he also says, and he's talking to the trustees, who are the people who are, responsible for, in some sense, responsible for preserving and carrying out the teachings. He says, sorry to say it, but none of you have understood. So he's made that statement on other occasions. What you say about wanting to make sure that nobody comes along purporting to, be his reincarnation or having received his wisdom somehow, he was very strong that he didn't want what he called interpreters. And that's another complicated and difficult question, because the prohibition against interpreters can have an unfortunate effect. It can prevent us from feeling free to speak and talk with one another. What does this mean? What does this mean? What is this about? But I guess I would just say that it's a live and important issue. Should we hear what Patik has to say?
Patik?
Yeah, because a lot of people are asking about this statement, so I feel sort of compelled to make a couple of comments. I've made some notes. So this business of who or what can understand, what is that energy, where does it go, what is the relationship of that energy with a body, such as he's talking about his body, and who can know this? So it so happens that you and many others, David, it's my contention, are taking that last statement significantly out of context. The context, and that's in the record, is that the day before he felt moved to make that statement, he had been informed by some people that there was a group of trustees who were at that time at Brockwood who had made a statement that the teacher is no longer there because he has received a blood transfusion, which they'd come to know, which had happened at the hospital. And therefore, what he says from this point on is not the teacher, is not K. And that statement was almost a direct response, including the insistence on the recording of that. It may not have a whole lot of significance beyond that. It certainly does not in terms of the generality of the teachings, because since 1929 he maintained that what is being said is within the capacity of any human being, simply by virtue of being a human being, not some extraordinary human being or something. So it completely contradicts. Right? As Mary said, when I approach it from Mary's point of view, there's no point. And we can talk about that. Where is this energy? Where does it come? Where does it go? What's the relationship with the body? The biggest expositions by K on this are extensive, and they're primarily in conversations with Pandit Jagannath Upadhyay. I'm not going to repeat the substance of it, but if somebody wants to read what he had to say, those are the discussions I would go to, including the relationship with the body. That's another big series with Mary Z, Pupul Jaikar, where they talked about the question of the boy, the voice, it goes, and he's explained it all. He's explained essentially the big K, little k, he's there as a person like anybody else. When there is a touch with that, that is gone. And then there's a reaction in the body. So it's there. Who can know it? K himself said many times he himself couldn't know this. Water can't know what is. If you work with me, so it's fallacious that, he somehow asserted that he knows and you don't. He said he himself does it. And the last thing, again, about this energy, and you started by, the teachings are vast, all of this, so, and you somehow conflated that with energy being vast. In the very last meeting of Krishnamurti with, the last formal meeting was actually with the trustees of the Indian Foundation in Vasant Vihar before he came here. The last part of the last meeting, they said, it's time for lunch. And he said, well, I have one more thing to say. And then he volunteered this. This wasn't even the conversation at the time. And he said, I've been talking for 60 years or more. It's, what we're talking about is this source of energy. It's vast. It's immeasurable. He said some words like that. And he said, you might be tempted to think that, there's something vast about this. And if only you looked carefully, you'll see it's so tiny, it's so small, the source of this. It's so specific and pinpointed that you could easily miss it. So the contention that because it covers a lot, it actually may not, but anyway, that's a different discussion. There's something in terms of the source that's vast, and who knows what. Krishnamurti absolutely refuted that. So thank you for allowing me these comments.
Thank you. Just to close, there are maybe two questions from the audience that are kind of unique as well, I thought. I don't know if this requires an answer, but it's just interesting. Krishnamurti was sometimes intense in dialogue. Have we lost some of the sharpness of his discourse for social nicety?
Wait, could you say that one more time?
K was sometimes intense in dialogue. Have we lost some of the sharpness of his discourse for social nicety?
Have we lost?
Yeah, that's the question. To you, Janka. He said to John Duncan.
No. I don't think anyone would accuse me of that.
Yeah, maybe no comment on that. Okay, and last one is, truth is a pathless land. This means there is no fixed method, doctrine, or path to follow. Each person must discover truth for themselves, moment by moment. So why live the teachings?
So why live the teachings?
Why, like we say, to live the teachings. But actually, on the other hand, Krishnamurti is talking about truth being a pathless land, and you have to discover it for yourself. So is there a contradiction when we say, why?
That's for David.
No, it's not for me. You take it.
Well, I have something to say about that, I think. And I don't know if perhaps this is just how I interpreted that statement question. I think we often confuse truth as a pathless land with you can follow any path to truth, or as long as it's your path, it will lead to truth. There's this identity with truth as being my truth versus yours, which I think is completely not what he was pointing to. I think in the same vein, when Kay says that there's no method, then we take that to, since there's no method and he gives us nothing to approach it with, then we say, oh, then any method goes, as long as it feels true to me. And I think that that's created even more confusion and division in the world if we really look at it honestly. So I think it's essential that we discover for ourselves what it means to live the teachings. And it will only be those of us who are serious about that who will perhaps come upon some form of right action, perhaps. And that's, to me, the most important thing in the world.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
Because I want to say yes, and what that is learning. It's not living the teachings. If you're learning something, you're learning. You're not deliberately living the teachings in order to get something. And that is the sort of bridge from being in conflict to not being in conflict, the learning aspect of which includes listening. And that is not living the teachings. You know, that's, from the outside you could say that's what it is, but there's no other rules to living the teachings than that. And those things propel themselves, you know. Learning is its own, not learning with accumulation or learning without accumulation, but still it has its own seriousness to it, which doesn't put you under the yoke of living the teachings, that type of thing, in my opinion. And that happens now, in the now, so there's no path to have to worry about or not worry about.
Perfect.
So are we done?
We're done. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you.